Hello everyone, and welcome back to Olive Boy Pens. It is truly a pleasure to have you here. Today we are going to be talking about a genre of pens rather than a specific pen or brand or anything like that. Today we are going to be talking about tiny pens. Not pocket pens, not small pens, but the truly minuscule. Pens that you might wonder why they exist, but also might find yourself strangely charmed by them, as I do. They are relatively uncommon in today's writing world for a couple of different reasons, in my opinion. First being the difficulty of manufacture. In the early days of pen manufacturing, making miniaturized components like filling systems, nibs, and just the whole pen at a certain point is kind of difficult and expensive just because of machining tolerances and the ability to create lots of tiny things at scale. For some early tiny little pens, like some that I will show you in this video, you can see this in that their parts are not actually directly interchangeable with the exact same model of pen from the same year, just because there was a lot of hand fitting going on, especially in the nib department. It is notoriously difficult to find a replacement Wahl No. 0 nib for this very reason. In the modern era, this issue persists, but in kind of the opposite direction. Instead of custom making parts per pen, the majority of pen makers today are using pre-made components like Bach or Jowo nibs, along with standard international cartridges. So a pen can't really get any smaller than that combined package. It's still pretty small, but it's worth mentioning that there is a floor generally on how small a pen can be if you're using standardized components. There are some exceptions, but they are very uncommon. The other point I have about why we don't see that many tiny pens on the market these days is just general impracticality. They are too small to use most of the time. Even posted, some of these pens that I have to show you today are not comfortable to use for any amount of time, and the use case of having a tiny fountain pen that you're going to have on you no matter what doesn't really make sense when there's something like a golf pencil or like a tiny ballpoint, which is a lot more practical in that it will last a lot longer, and you don't really need to focus on your writing qualities so much if you're using what essentially amounts to a last-ditch effort of being able to write something down. It's also worth mentioning how easy they are to lose. I just spent an hour looking for one of the pens I was going to film this video about right before the video started. And that is just maybe all that needs to be said. But it makes me think about how many of these tiny vintage pens were just lost. You don't see a lot of huge, fancy, expensive vintage pens going lost, but I'm sure so many were dropped down sewer grates and stuff like that. Of course, there also becomes a point where when the pen is so tiny, it gets put into a fancy box and put away forever, like a Waterman doll pen, which I do not have, unfortunately, but here's a picture of one. A lot of them notably have a ring top, which you can use to attach to, a chatelaine or a ring, like a necklace, which is, kind of fun. And I was tempted by that funness many a time, including the last time I did it, which was I decided to wear my Wahl No. 0 around my neck to go to work at the Lamy store, which was, it was foolish. I'm very comfortable telling you guys about that. But I was walking across the street to go to lunch, and somehow the cap unthreaded, and I had it outside of my shirt, and it fell as I was crossing the street, into traffic. And luckily, the pen is still here to, tell the tale, but I never wore it out after that, as you can probably imagine. Especially knowing that the nib is largely irreplaceable and kind of too small to really work on. Or I'm sure I could find someone. But anyway, easy to lose, hard to use when you can. And speaking about ring tops too, if you have one on a necklace, you have to uncap it, and then you have this tiny little pen that you can't even post because the cap's on the necklace. It's just, they're silly. And yet, here I am, charmed by them, to the point that I'm going to talk about them on camera for some amount of time. So, let's take a look at the first two of our 4 pens that we're going to take a look at today. A Wahl number 0 and number 2 ring top.
Alright, so here's a look at these 2 first silly little objects. If you want to call them pens, that's up to you, but sure. So these are Wahl number 0 and number 2 ring tops. They don't really have like formal names because you just order these via catalog or in a store. What I can tell you about them is the names of the chasing patterns on their gold-filled bodies. This is a checkerboard pattern, and the larger number 2 pen has a chevron pattern with a little engraved cartouche that reads Audrey. Shout out to all the Audreys out there. So these are fairly early pens. The number 2 is a little bit older, as you can tell by the lever that sticks out of the side of the body a little bit. That indicates that this is a gold-filled overlay over an ebonite body before, metal manufacturing was really good enough to make a solid metal pen in relatively thin stock, basically. This number 0 is an all-metal Wahl, and you didn't see these in an ebonite version because they would just be too small. They're both ring tops, of course, as I mentioned. And the number that goes with the name is a reference to what size of nib they have. Nibs, of course, that are very, very small. The number 2 actually has a pretty large nib proportional to its size, but, again, in the grand scheme of things, pretty tiny. And they are marked, though you may not be able to see it in this shot, with Wahl 0 14K and Wahl 2, because they're number 0 and number 2 nibs. These are both, as I mentioned, lever fillers. This one is kind of flush with the body and snaps in nicely when you press it in. Of course, I can't do it now because it's got ink in it, but these are very truly small. For reference, I will pull out the trusty Lamy Safari. You could probably fit, you can fit the whole pen in here, maybe almost both. And this is a 5mm graph paper in case, that's needed for scale. This is about, 110 millimeters, 200-ish. And then the Safari is, big. So let's take a look and see how they write. These both being pretty early gold nibbed pens actually have really, really nice nibs. I'm always kind of impressed when I use them, how nice they are. The number 0, which we're going to start with, has Pelican Olivine, which was an ink of the year. And we're just going to get right into it. So it is actually a pretty springy nib. It kind of skips sometimes. It is very fine, even on this is smooth Romeo notebook. And it's got a decent amount of feedback, being so fine. But again, it's got some bounce to it. I have much larger nibs that have much, less flex out of them. So it is always a pleasant surprise. You'll also see just how silly this pen is to hold. It is so small. It's smaller than any other writing instrument I have, and is definitely not usable for any amount of time as like a writing pen. I can't really imagine what use case this was made for, especially seeing it unposted, so if you had this dangling on your neck or whatever, I can't even, I have to brace it against the inside of my, so silly. Tiny pen. So let's go on to its slightly larger sibling. The number two. The number two has a larger nib and a much flexier nib, I will add. This was actually a flea market find, which is wild. I think I paid like $50 for it, which is a great price as far as I'm concerned. A nice gold-filled pen with a flex nib. Yes, please. And this has Pelican Smoky Quartz, which is another ink of the year. This nib is also nice and stubby. Got some nice innate line variation without even pushing on it, and has quite nice flow. The tip did require some re-bending into place because it was a bit bent when I got it, but works perfectly now. One thing I love about these Wahl nibs too is the heart-shaped breather hole. I think that's really charming. Let's get some flex out of here. Oh, yeah. So quite wet flow. You're going to definitely want to use this on a nicer paper that's going to be able to handle it, but you can really get some nice bounce out of this thing. And I try not to push it too hard, but sometimes I can't help myself, to be honest. It really makes this kind of boring ink look really nice. It makes shading inks look really good. It's a bummer that it has a rubber sack in it, so I don't feel comfortable putting crazier inks in it, but if I did, it would be super fun. Anyway, let's move on from these two little guys to something else. Perhaps something a bit more relatively modern.
Hope you enjoyed taking a look at those two tiny little friends of mine. And let's take a look at the next pen. It is another Wahl pen a little bit later, and it has a fun historical aspect to it.
Well, 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 what do we have here? Another very small pen. And another Wahl pen. Though the history regarding this pen is also kind of interesting in that this is actually not branded as a Wahl Eversharp pen as it would be at its time of release normally in 1933. This reads on the barrel, made in USA by the makers of Eversharp. So this was kind of a cheaper tier of pen than Wahl Eversharp kind of wanted to be associated with. So they just marketed it as its kind of own thing. Many pen brands did this, like a lot of different brands kind of tried out weird stuff under different brand names to not tarnish their legacy, but this is an example of that, even though it does kind of fit with the design cues of other Wahl Eversharp pens of the time. This one is also cool because of what it says on its cap band. So this was a commonly made pen, but this one specifically was made for the 1933 Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago. These are pretty hard to come by. This I also found at the same flea market in Alameda, California, as the other Wahl ringtop, the number 2 that I mentioned earlier. And it appears to have leaked on me, which is unfortunate. We'll get back to that. While I've got the blind cap off, you'll see that this is a bulb filling pen, which is rather uncommon. You squeeze this little thingy at the back, and that pulls ink from the nib side through a breather tube, and then it fills the barrel in here. So ink doesn't actually go in here so much. Obviously, some can come out, but the idea is that this is the reservoir and this is the filling unit, and you kind of squeeze it to fill it. This one, so these pens were made with both steel and gold nibs. Luckily for me, this is a gold nibbed version. I probably wouldn't have picked it up if it were a steel nibbed version. But yeah, it's got the same-ish sized number 0 nib. Like I said, these were not super standardized, so I can actually see that the one on the Bantam is a little bit wider, even though they're marked as both number 0s. And this later one on the Bantam also says Made in USA on the bottom, which I think is an interesting thing to try and fit in that amount of space. So yeah, very small. The cap has a little clip with a pointed dome at the top. It kind of is reminiscent of a Wahl Doric or a round Doric from the same era. And it's got this, kind of nice celluloid. It's got some waves to it, but it does feel very light, very cheap. And wow, it really is leaking on me. Where is that coming from? Anyway, yeah, the clip is pretty much useless. It is very thin. It is also kind of tight, and doesn't attach to anything particularly well. I've had this pen leak on me, not just this time, multiple times, and I think it's just by fault of the not so great bulb filler design. But the nib on this thing is also kind of crazy. So let me show you how it writes. Just kidding. I gotta refill it because it leaked. I guess this is as good a time as any to show you how it actually fills. I'm going to fill it with Jacques Herbin Lavande, which is a nice blue. I'm only going to squeeze it once because I don't want it to fill it too much so that it does not leak on me once more. This is kind of demonstrating the difficulty of getting a miniaturized filling system into a pen. Cartridges weren't a thing yet. Nobody was making cartridges, so it's not like you could just slap a standard international in there. Not that it would even fit. But now that it is ready to go, let's take it for a spin. So this is a really nice, like almost medium to broad stub nib with a little bit of flex in it too, which is surprising coming out of such a tiny, frankly, kind of terrible pen. Oh look, it's somehow... it's just starting to get a little comedic at this point. But it's super wet, which is funny to me because it has, just a suggestion of ink capacity. It is nothing. I think I could probably burn through this in this writing sample if I wanted to. But when flex, it dumps even more ink onto the page. And it's such a fascinating little piece of history. I love that it was made for the World's Fair. It's kind of a rare thing. Not that I agree generally with the institutions of the World's Fairs, but still, pretty cool, pretty fun, and undoubtedly a very small, even if somewhat terrible pen. Oh, lastly, before I forget, size comparison with the Safari. Look at them. It's just silly. Who's going to use that?
Finally, for some diversity, we've got a modern-day pen, the Kaweco Lilliput. This is kind of the modern tiny pen that people talk about and use, but it really does have some design features that keep it out of my pocket on a daily basis. Let's check those out.
Alrighty, let's take a look at this modern tiny pen, the Kaweco Lilliput. The outside has a lot less to look at than the other two pens we've looked at. It's got the Kaweco logo very faintly laser engraved into the top of the cap there. It's almost impossible to see. And the back is threaded for reasons I will disclose very shortly. You unthread the cap. There's an all brass body. And then you can, if you choose, and you will choose, to thread the cap on the back of the pen. This makes it actually, a somewhat decent length to use. It is a little bit thicker than the other pens we've used, being that it has to accommodate a standard number 5 nib unit as well as a cartridge. So definitely a lot more usable when deployed. The grip, having been used for a few years now, has got some patina to it. It did all originally look like this smooth brass. And yeah, the nib is normally would be a pretty standard stainless steel Kaweco nib, but I did grind it because that was boring. And there's a look at the cartridge filling system, very standard. And even though this is maybe the most useful out of all of them, it is also in a way not that useful because it doesn't have any way of being secured. No ring, no clip, And this was the pen that I spent an hour looking for because it forgot it in some jacket pocket after taking it out. And that's kind of my fault. But if it had been clipped, that's kind of like you notice it on your, taking your jacket off or something, or your pants. So I wish it had some kind of clip. You can get an accommodation clip for these, but they slip off way too easily in my experience. So it's like then you just have the clip attached to your pants and the pen is loose, which is just quite silly. All that being said, let's look at the rating. Of course, it's aftermarket experience, so, it's not the experience you'd be seeing every day. The nib beforehand was kind of meh, so that's what you can maybe expect from a steel Kaweco nib. I honestly do not remember what ink I put in here. It's kind of grayish. I don't remember doing that. But the nib grind I put on here is an Architect, because I found myself enjoying this for jotting down quick notes, and I do that in block letters, so it was just a match made in heaven. It's a decently comfortable size, I would say. I would definitely not want to use it to, write my memoirs, but it could be a lot worse. And unlike the other pens, being a modern steel-nibbed pen, there is no flexibility to speak of. It is very stiff. And that's pretty much that. This pen is made in a lot of different finishes, but they're all largely the same deal. You can get one with like brass waves. You can get one stainless steel that's like torched. You can get one that's not torched. You can get an aluminum one, which I actually have had and lost. Because I forgot the wallet that it was in at a top drawer in Los Angeles. But yeah, this is like an okay pen. It's also way more expensive than I think anyone should pay for it. I think the brass version is like $70 new, which is absurd for what amounts to a small pen with a standard nib unit and cartridge. So yeah, take that how you will. And that brings us to the end of our tiny little pens. Let me show them all next to each other, next to the Safari. So there's a Safari, there's a Lilliput, there's the Wahl Bantam, there's the number 2 ring top, and the number 0 ring top. Feast your eyes.
Alrighty, folks, I hope you enjoyed this look into the tiny little Smurf world of tiny pens. I love these. Obviously, I have to actively stop myself from accumulating them because, again, largely useless. But if you find yourself as charmed as I am by them, leave a like, maybe subscribe. Tell me about any tiny pens that you've enjoyed in your day-to-day life in the comments below. And yeah, I will see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.